Imagine a square filled with people, their faces twisted with fear and fascination, the air thick with smoke, and the acrid scent of burning wood. In the center, a man writhes on a rack, his limbs stretched beyond human endurance, every sinew screaming in agony. Nearby, a condemned woman kneels beneath the shadow of the executioner's blade, the crowd's collective breath caught in grim anticipation. This was medieval justice, a world where punishment was never private, never hidden. It was a spectacle, a performance of power, designed to strike fear as sharply as any sword. Pain was currency, and authority its relentless collector. In these times, the line between crime and spectacle blurred. Offenses that today might seem trivial, stealing a loaf of bread, questioning a lord, or uttering a heretical thought, could condemn a person to torment unimaginable. Torture was a tool of confession, humiliation, and terror. The rack, the Iron Maiden, the breaking wheel, each instrument was meticulously designed to inflict maximum suffering, not only to punish the body, but to dominate the mind. It was not enough to die. The punishment had to echo, imprinting itself on memory, on conscience, on the very soul of society. Medieval courts understood that fear was as potent as law. Public executions became warnings etched into the streets, marketplaces, and churches. Justice was theater, morality enforced through spectacle, and cruelty codified in the name of God, king, or law. Yet beneath the wooden scaffolds and stone walls, one question lingered. What could be worse than death itself? Could suffering stretch beyond the limits of flesh and time, searing itself into the psyche of the victim and the witnesses alike? In this world, death was rarely swift. Pain was prolonged, humiliation meticulous, and terror unrelenting. To witness it was to confront the abyss within humanity, to see how power could twist mercy into monstrosity. And as we step into the shadows of history, we begin to understand that the medieval mind did not merely punish crime, it orchestrated fear, manipulated obedience, and crafted horrors that continue to haunt our imagination. The abyss awaits, and within it lies the question that will drive our journey through the darkest corners of human justice. In medieval Europe, fear was not merely an emotion, it was a carefully crafted instrument of governance. Kings, lords, and magistrates understood that obedience could not rely solely on laws written in parchment. It demanded a visceral, unforgettable reminder of the consequences of defiance. The body, publicly displayed and tormented, became the ultimate lesson. Streets and town squares transformed into open classrooms where suffering taught morality and law, and where the boundaries of human endurance became a public spectacle. Religion amplified this control. The church claimed authority over both soul and body, presenting pain as a path to redemption or a warning against sin. Confession and penance were powerful tools. But when moral persuasion failed, punishment became corporeal. Torture was justified as purification, as a means to save souls even while annihilating flesh. Heresy, theft, adultery, or rebellion were not only crimes against the crown or community, they were affronts to God. The intertwining of spiritual and temporal authority ensured that cruelty wore the mask of divine justice. The monarchy reinforced this hierarchy through fear. Noble courts orchestrated punishments to demonstrate absolute power. Peasants, artisans, and even minor nobles could witness the consequences of challenging authority. The rack, the thumbscrew, and the breaking wheel were not randomly barbaric. They were meticulously designed to extend suffering, to humiliate, and to communicate a clear message. The crown's reach was absolute and resistance was unthinkable. Public executions, floggings, and burnings were as much about entertainment as enforcement, each spectacle a warning encoded in flesh, echoing through marketplaces, taverns, and villages. Medieval law was intertwined with social order, yet it often blurred the line between justice and cruelty. Punishments were intentionally disproportionate to crime, magnifying the consequences to impress upon the community the stakes of transgression. A petty thief could be drawn and quartered. A political opponent might face dismemberment or slow immolation. Mercy was selective, often a privilege of status. While the lower classes endured the most extreme horrors, death alone rarely sufficed. Survival in agony became a tool of psychological domination, reinforcing the social hierarchy and the omnipotence of rulers. Yet beneath this orchestration of terror lay a paradox. These punishments, horrific as they were, also reflect a society obsessed with morality, order, and the preservation of power. Fear was law, but it was law tempered by spectacle, ritual, and theology, a delicate, terrifying balance. By understanding the structures that gave rise to these brutal practices, we begin to see how cruelty was not merely instinctual, but deliberate, calculated, and socially sanctioned. This foundation of fear sets the stage for the instruments, rituals, and human suffering we will explore next. Where the line between punishment and artful torment becomes indistinguishably thin, the Iron Maiden, a towering coffin of iron, lined with spikes that waited silently for flesh. To the uninitiated, it was a grim legend. To those condemned, a terrifying reality. Victims were enclosed within its metal embrace, the spikes piercing in precise locations, designed to prolong agony without causing immediate death. Screams echoed in stone halls as bodies contorted, finding no relief from the calculated cruelty. The psychological torment was as potent as the physical. The knowledge of the spikes, the slow inevitability of pressure, the suffocating enclosure created a profound, inescapable dread. Historians recount cases where the Iron Maiden became a tool not only to punish but to coerce confessions, turning fear itself into evidence. Then there was the Judas cradle, a device designed with perverse ingenuity. A pointed pyramid rose from the floor, and the condemned was seated upon it, gradually lowered by ropes or weights. The body was stretched, impaled in a manner that seemed to suspend the victim between life and death. Limbs strained unnaturally, muscles screamed, and the mind became a theater of despair. Witnesses often describe the victim's gradual descent into madness, each movement a reminder of powerlessness. Unlike the Iron Maiden, which crushed the body internally, the Judas cradle imposed a relentless external force, exploiting the human body's vulnerabilities while maximizing psychological torment. The breaking wheel was another instrument designed for spectacle as much as punishment. A condemned criminal was bound to a large wheel, then struck repeatedly with iron bars or hammers, shattering bones in deliberate order. Limbs twisted, joints dislocated, and life ebbed slowly with each calculated blow. Some victims survived for hours, their suffering a grim narrative for the spectators who gathered to witness the consequences of crime. The wheel was rotated so that every wound and contortion could be observed, each moment reinforcing fear across the audience. The methodical destruction of the human body became a communal lesson in obedience and the omnipotence of law. The rack, one of the most infamous tortures of the era, exploited both pain and confession. Victims were bound, wrists and ankles secured to rollers at opposite ends of a wooden frame. As the rollers turned, limbs stretched, joints popped, and sinews tore. Many confessed crimes they had not committed, for the human body cannot endure unending tension without breaking. Yet the horror was not only physical, being suspended between life and unbearable pain, forced to articulate lies under threat of further agony, left lasting psychological scars. Accounts describe the terror of anticipation, the mind consumed with each deliberate twist of the wheel or turn of the roller, understanding that relief was impossible until authority decreed it. Less widely known, but equally brutal, were instruments designed for humiliation alongside pain. The scavenger's daughter compressed the body instead of stretching it, forcing the victim into a crouched, immobile position while inflicting excruciating internal pressure. Victims often vomited, fainted, or lost control of bodily functions, enduring not only suffering, but shame. Such devices were psychologically devastating because they attacked dignity as fiercely as flesh. Meanwhile, devices like the heretic's fork immobilized the head and throat, suspending the victim between two bars, leaving them unable to move or rest. Each breath a reminder of constraint and inevitability. In these tortures, the human element was central. Victims were not abstractions, they were mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, and citizens, whose bodies became instruments of spectacle and obedience. Letters, court records, and contemporary accounts describe screams, echoing through stone halls, families collapsing in grief, and onlookers frozen between horror and fascination. Pain was amplified by ritual, by audience, by anticipation, and by the perverse care with which devices were designed to prolong suffering, It was not simply death they inflicted, it was a confrontation with the fragility of human existence, the dominance of authority, and the vulnerability of the mind and body under calculated cruelty. These instruments, each more horrifying than the last, were not anomalies but pillars of medieval justice. They were crafted to shock, terrify, and control, ensuring that fear became both deterrent and spectacle. As we peer into these grim histories, it becomes impossible to separate the ingenuity of human creation from the capacity for cruelty. Every spike, every wheel, every rack reveals a society obsessed with dominance, a civilization where pain was both punishment and performance. It is within these mechanical horrors that we see the essence of medieval justice, precise, theatrical, and unrelenting, a shadow cast long across centuries of human memory. Beyond the notorious instruments that dominate grim history books, there existed a shadowed realm of punishment so intimate, so precise in their cruelty, that even contemporaries sometimes recoiled. These were not designed merely to kill or inflict pain. They were crafted to penetrate the very essence of identity, sexuality, and personal dignity. While the Iron Maiden or the breaking wheel terrorized the masses, these forbidden instruments operated in the shadows, a private theater of shame and fear, wielded to assert total control over the body and psyche of the condemned. Heresy, adultery, and betrayal were crimes that struck not only at social order but at the moral and spiritual fabric of society. Punishments were often tailored to the perceived nature of the sin, ensuring that humiliation and terror mirrored the supposed moral failing. Adulterers might be placed in the pillory, exposed in public, with devices that pinched, burned, or mutilated sensitive areas, turning private acts into communal spectacle. Beyond pain, these punishments attacked identity, forcing victims to endure shame, ostracization, and degradation. The body became a canvas on which authority painted lessons in obedience and morality. The heretic's fork, while known, had variations that were quietly deployed against those accused of spiritual transgression. One version pressed the chin and chest between iron bars, preventing sleep, forcing the condemned to remain upright for days. Eyes grew heavy, heads ached, and the mind, starved of rest, drifted toward hallucination and despair. It was psychological warfare as much as physical restraint. Victims were forced into a state of perpetual vulnerability, aware that any attempt to relax, to close the eyes, could lead to injury or worse. This slow erosion of bodily autonomy broke resistance far more effectively than brute force alone. Some punishments were surgical in their cruelty, exploiting the human body's natural vulnerabilities. Devices like the breast ripper or the buttock ripper, aimed at women accused of adultery or sexual transgression, were designed not only to inflict excruciating pain but to erase femininity and sexuality from the victim. Flesh was torn, blood flowed, and yet the most enduring torment was the invasion of personal dignity, the realization that the body could be publicly violated in the name of justice. Similarly, male victims of betrayal or sodomy accusations faced instruments that humiliated as much as they wounded, leaving scars both visible and invisible, a permanent testament to authority's reach. Even punishment for betrayal, treason, or political dissent was often intimate, designed to imprint fear directly into the soul. Fingers, ears, or tongues might be removed. Branding and mutilation transformed human flesh into a living warning. These acts were meticulously documented in court records, yet the intensity of shame and psychological torment was often understated. Pain alone could kill, but the terror of exposure, the manipulation of identity, and the stripping away of autonomy left scars that survived long after the body healed or ceased to exist. In essence, these forbidden tortures reveal a society that weaponized intimacy. Authority could reach into the most personal corners of life, thought, body, and desire, and convert them into instruments of control. Victims were made to feel utterly powerless, their minds as much a battlefield as their bodies. The terror was total, intimate, and often invisible to the wider world, leaving an insidious legacy of fear that extended beyond the scaffold or dungeon. These punishments, too cruel for public memory, existed to remind both the condemned and the witnesses that authority was absolute. Unlike the mechanical horrors of the rack or wheel, their effects were subtle yet enduring. Shame, paranoia, and an understanding that no aspect of life was beyond scrutiny or domination. In this hidden landscape, cruelty became artful, precise, and deeply psychological, a stark contrast to the broad, theatrical suffering of public torture. By exploring these forbidden punishments, we confront the most personal dimensions of medieval cruelty, where the mind, dignity, and body were all battlegrounds in a society obsessed with power and control. The cold stones of medieval dungeons still echo with the screams of those who suffered, their names etched into history through pain and fear. Take, for instance, Agnes Waterhouse, accused of witchcraft in 1566 England. Her trial was swift, her condemnation brutal. Stripped of dignity, Agnes was paraded before the townspeople, her alleged crimes transformed into a spectacle of terror. The executioner's rope was only the final act in a long performance of humiliation and fear, designed to demonstrate that deviation from societal norms invited not merely death, but degradation, shaming, and horror. In France, in 1440, a man named Gilles de Rais, once a nobleman and military hero, was accused of heresy and murder. His punishment was meticulous and symbolic. Publicly shamed, tortured, and eventually executed, Gilles' fall from grace became propaganda, a warning to those who would wield power without piety. Chroniclers recorded not just the mechanics of his torture, but the atmosphere of fear that enveloped the town. The whispers of betrayal, the crowd's collective dread, and the executioner's careful orchestration of suffering. Gilles' body, broken and displayed, was a lesson written in flesh and blood. Accused heretics faced similar fates. Jan Hus, burned at the stake in 1415, became both victim and martyr. His trial and execution were public, theatrical, and terrifying. Flames consumed him slowly, his cries mingling with the chants of onlookers convinced of the righteousness of their law and faith. Yet even as death approached, the psychological torment, humiliation, isolation, and the realization that one's body would be destroyed as a symbol made the punishment far crueler than the inevitable end. His suffering reverberated, inspiring fear and devotion alike. Political prisoners often endured the most calculated torments. In 1483, Richard, Duke of York, found himself at the mercy of the Tower of London. Accused of treason, he faced prolonged interrogations and physical torment intended to extract confessions. Guards meticulously employed techniques designed to break both body and will: stretching, constriction, deprivation. Every detail was intended to amplify terror, demonstrating to the populace that rebellion carried consequences beyond death, consequences that could linger in memory and spirit. Even ordinary citizens could face extraordinary horrors. Margaret Clitheroe, executed in 1586 for harboring priests, was pressed to death under heavy weights, a punishment intended to silence her without bloodshed, yet infinitely more excruciating in its slow, suffocating intensity. Her courage contrasted sharply with the calculated cruelty of her executioners, highlighting the cruel efficiency of medieval law as both tool of obedience and theater of terror. These stories reveal a society that transformed suffering into spectacle, fear into governance, and pain into narrative. Each case was more than punishment. It was propaganda, a lesson etched into the collective consciousness. The victims, noble or peasant, heretic or political opponent, became instruments in a broader system of control. By humanizing their experiences, we glimpse not only the horrors of their fate, but the meticulous orchestration of terror that defined the medieval imagination. These were lives, ambitions, and dreams destroyed, transformed into cautionary tales for generations. History preserves the names of the condemned, but it is their suffering that lingers. Pain became language, humiliation became precedent, and fear became law. In these bloodstained stories, the reality of medieval cruelty emerges not as abstraction, but as lived experience, echoing across time, reminding us that behind every legend of torture, there was a human being whose life was made a canvas for terror. The horrors of medieval justice did not vanish with the passing of centuries. They evolved, leaving traces in the way societies perceive law, punishment, and fear. Public executions may have faded, but the human fascination with spectacle, control, and the moral theater of suffering persists. Prisons, tribunals, and media trials continue to wield authority not just through verdicts, but through visibility, drama, and the subtle terror of consequence. The psychological mechanisms that once shaped obedience through terror are mirrored in modern debates over justice, punishment, and deterrence. Even in art, literature, and cinema, the medieval imagination endures. We are drawn to stories of suffering, resilience, and cruelty, compelled by a mixture of horror and curiosity. Perhaps it is because these stories confront us with our own mortality, our fragility, and the enduring tension between morality and power. They remind us that cruelty is not simply a historical artifact, it is a thread woven through human culture, adapted and reinterpreted across time. As we close this journey through pain, spectacle, and terror, one truth becomes clear. The past's brutality still whispers. It lingers in the fascination with what we fear, the stories we tell about justice, and the shadows we cast over human behavior. Medieval cruelty was extreme, calculated, and horrifying, yet its echoes persist. Haunting reminders that our obsession with power, punishment, and fear is timeless, as compelling as it is unsettling. The abyss of history speaks, and we continue to listen.